Before he left the country, Ronan Gallagher covered every wall of the lakeside mansion on Lake Michigan with photographs of his wife and the man she thought she had hidden. Not one frame was crooked, not one image was blurred. By the time Camille walked through the front door that afternoon, home early to set the stage for the announcement she had been orchestrating for months, the house no longer looked like a home. It looked like a courtroom built from glossy paper, cold light, and 6 years of lies. She froze beneath the crystal chandelier. On the staircase, in the dining room, along the gallery hall, beside their wedding portrait everywhere. It was her and the family's own lawyer, in hotel corridors, in a secret apartment, inside the very chapel where no camera was ever allowed to point. Camille did not scream. The one who screamed was the man who walked in 10 minutes behind her, arriving as the family's attorney, right up until he saw the final wall. The wall reserved for him alone, the wall that even Camille had never known existed. On the console table in the foyer, Ronan had left one envelope. Inside it was a signed divorce agreement, a flash drive, and a sealed medical file, the kind of file that made Camille grip the edge of the table to stay on her feet when she opened it. Beneath it all, a handwritten note in a hand calm enough to chill the room. "Congratulations on your ceremony. I returned the truth to this house before I left." And in the bedroom of the old man recovering from heart surgery, Ronan had hung nothing at all. He had simply placed a worn notebook back on the nightstand, the notebook of a nurse this family had once crushed. And that notebook was the thing that would bring the whole empire to its knees. If this story touched something in you, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes the truth always finds its way home. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story about quiet strength, betrayal, and the moment justice finally arrives. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Ronan's place? 8 months before the photographs covered the walls, Ronan Gallagher sat at the head of a long table in a conference room overlooking the Chicago harbor, where 6 men representing a foreign shipping corporation had spent 3 weeks preparing for this negotiation. They had brought 2 attorneys, an interpreter, and a list of terms they believed no one would dare refuse. Ronan listened for 40 minutes without saying a word. He didn't tap his fingers, glance at his watch, or shift in his chair. When the head of the delegation finished speaking, Ronan simply placed a single sheet of paper on the table, pushed it forward, then rose and fastened the button of his suit jacket. The interpreter hadn't even finished translating the page before all 6 men had signed it. In this city, people whispered that the gunfire of the Gallagher family wasn't as frightening as the silence of its 3rd-generation heir, because when Ronan fell silent, it meant he had finished counting, and once he had finished counting, everything had already been decided before anyone had the chance to open his mouth and ask for more time. He was 34 years old, with black hair, gray eyes, and a faint scar running along the left side of his jaw, though no one dared ask where it had come from anymore. He controlled the docks, the buildings, and the streams of money flowing unseen beneath the city, and he was doing what his father had never dared to do, drawing the entire family out of the darkness and into the light, one contract at a time, one legitimate company at a time. Slowly and carefully, the way a man might dismantle a landmine. But power came with a price no one printed on paper. In the evenings, Ronan returned to the mansion beside Lake Michigan, where his wife, Camille, presided over intimate gatherings filled with smiles, arranged as perfectly as the candles along the dining table. After 6 years of marriage, everything remained proper. She stood beside him at ceremonies, linked her arm through his in photographs, and called him darling in front of their guests. And there was nothing between them. Not a single argument, because arguments required people to still care. Not one breakfast filled with laughter, because laughter required people to want to remain at the table for another 5 minutes. Ronan believed this was the price of the world in which he lived. That men like him weren't born to have a home, but only to guard an estate. He had grown accustomed to rooms crowded with people, yet utterly without a pulse. There was only one place in that mansion without cameras, the small chapel in the eastern wing, where his grandmother, the woman who had built the family beside her husband with nothing but their bare hands and a ship that had carried them away from Ireland, had established a rule no one was permitted to change, that no one should ever watch a person who was making a confession. Ronan honored that rule as he honored a promise made to the dead, and he had more promises to the dead than he did to the living. The heaviest of those promises belonged to his mother. When he was 20 years old and studying abroad, her heart stopped one night, and no one managed to bring a doctor to her in time. By the time he returned, all he could do was touch a hand that had already grown cold. 14 years had passed. Ronan had forgiven many enemies, but he had never forgiven the distance of that overnight flight. So when Uncle Cormac, the founder of the family, the 70-year-old man who had taught him everything from how to tie a necktie to how to read betrayal in a man's eyes, needed heart surgery, Ronan broke one of his own rules. He, the man who had never allowed a stranger to pass through the mansion gates, ordered his people to find the finest nurse in the state, whatever the cost, regardless of her background, with only one requirement, that she must keep the old man's heart beating. The personnel department submitted 3 files. Ronan studied only one of them closely, the file of a 27-year-old intensive care nurse, whose record had led her department chief to write a single sentence of recommendation. If my daughter had to be hospitalized, I would want this woman on the night shift. Ronan approved the file without meeting her, without conducting an interview, without even looking at her photograph for more than 2 seconds. It was only a stranger's name printed in the corner of a page. Tessa Marlowe. He had no way of knowing that his signature would become the most important decision of his life. More important than every business deal, every dock, and every building combined. 3 days later, Ronan left for the airport to begin an 11-week business trip to Singapore, for the largest deal in his plan to make the family legitimate. He kissed his wife's cheek with the proper formality beside the car, and Camille smiled and waved until the vehicle disappeared beyond the iron gates. Her smile vanished as quickly as a candle flame pinched between 2 fingers. Inside the house, her phone lit up with a message containing only 4 words. He's gone now. On the same night, Ronan's car passed through the mansion gates. On the other side of the city, Tessa Marlowe stood in the intensive care unit of a public hospital, with her fingers resting against the wrist of an elderly man who had just survived a critical episode, her eyes fixed on the small nurse's watch pinned to the front of her uniform. The machines around the bed were still running, and the numbers continued to flicker across the monitors, but she counted by hand, 1 beat at a time, as though machines were meant to offer guidance, while the human touch was what deserved to be trusted. It was a habit her mother had left her, along with that watch. Her mother had also been a nurse, and she used to tell her daughter that a machine could measure a heartbeat, but couldn't measure a human being, and that a good nurse had to touch her patients, had to let them know that someone was truly there. Her parents had died in a fire when she was 19, just as she had begun nursing school, and from that night forward, the watch became the only thing she carried with her through every shift. When her shift ended at 6 o'clock in the morning, Tessa didn't go home right away. She sat in the locker room and opened the envelope that had been in her pocket for 2 days, the one she hadn't dared to read a second time. It was a notice from a debt collection agency. The medical loan taken out in her younger sister Piper's name for surgery 2 years earlier had been sold to another finance company. The interest rate had been adjusted, and the monthly payment had nearly doubled. Tessa read the number on the final line and did the calculation she had done hundreds of times before. 1 nurse's salary, minus rent, minus her sister's tuition, minus food, and the answer was always the same. It wasn't enough. Her phone vibrated. Piper was calling, her voice trying to sound cheerful in the way only family could recognize as forced, asking whether her sister had eaten breakfast, talking about classes, and then, only near the end of the call, hesitantly admitting that the school had just sent a notice saying that if the next semester's tuition wasn't paid on time, she would have to suspend her studies. But it was all right. She could work for a year and return to school later. Tessa stared at the locker in front of her and listened to her little sister, the child she had raised since the age of 11, teaching herself how to surrender a dream so gently that it wouldn't hurt her older sister quite as much. In the calmest voice she could manage, Tessa told her that she wouldn't be suspending anything, that she would take care of it, then ended the call and sat motionless for a long time in the room, heavy with the smell of disinfectant. That afternoon, the head nurse called her into the office and explained that a wealthy family was looking for a private nurse to provide overnight care for a relative who had recently undergone heart surgery. They had specifically asked for the very best, and the compensation they were offering was 3 times her hospital salary. The woman added only one thing, that it was the Gallagher family, and in this city people didn't ask many questions about that name. They only needed to know that the Gallaghers paid on time and didn't appreciate curiosity. Tessa didn't need the rest of the afternoon to decide. 3 times her salary meant Piper's semester would be saved. It meant that debt, at least for this year, wouldn't swallow both sisters whole. She signed the contract on Friday, and by Sunday night she was standing before the iron gates of a mansion beside Lake Michigan. Gates more than 10 feet high, carrying her nursing bag, and listening to the sound of her own footsteps echo along the stone path through a garden trimmed so precisely that not a single leaf seemed permitted to grow out of place. The housekeeper, a woman named Brennan, led her through long corridors lined with portraits of generations past and briefly explained the rules of the house, which areas she wasn't allowed to enter, which hours she wasn't permitted to walk the halls, before finally stopping outside the patient's room. Cormac Gallagher lay in the bed, 70 years old, with the face of a man who had spent his entire life giving orders and now had to remain still while someone else guarded the beating of his heart, though his eyes were still sharp, as though the surgery had reached his chest but hadn't touched his gaze. He watched the new nurse from the moment she entered, noticing where she placed her bag, how she washed her hands, and how carefully she checked every medication on the table. Then, when it was time to take his pulse, he saw that the young woman didn't look at the expensive modern machines surrounding the bed. Instead, she gently took his wrist in her hand, lowered her eyes to the small, worn watch pinned to her uniform, and silently counted, with her lips barely moving, her fingers warm and steady against his skin like a promise. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the second hand could be heard. Cormac Gallagher, a man who had survived his entire life by seeing through people before they had the chance to speak, studied the young woman for a long moment before saying, his voice rough but every word clear, that she counted as though a human life were something worth counting carefully. Tessa looked up, but before she could answer, the old man continued, his eyes never leaving her, saying that in this house, people rarely counted anything except money. She remained silent for one heartbeat, then replied that from tonight onward, the house had one more person who counted something else. For the first time since the surgery, the corner of the Gallagher family founder's mouth lifted into something that almost resembled a smile. 3 weeks after that first night, Ronan flew back to Chicago in the middle of his business trip to sign a series of documents that couldn't be delegated, intending to remain for only 4 days before returning to Singapore. His flight landed close to midnight, and when the car carried him through the mansion gates, the entire house had already fallen into darkness, except for one illuminated window in the eastern wing, Uncle Cormac's room. Ronan went straight upstairs, his footsteps making no sound, the habit of a man raised in a world where a noise could be the last thing someone ever heard, and he stopped at the partially open doorway. Inside, a young woman in a nurse's uniform sat beside the bed with her back straight, one hand holding the sleeping old man's wrist, her eyes lowered to a small watch pinned to her chest, while her other hand wrote neat, steady lines in a notebook resting on her lap. She didn't hear him, or perhaps she did and simply didn't consider his presence more important than finishing the full minute she was counting. Ronan stood there watching the scene longer than he had intended, because in this house he was accustomed to every door opening and everyone immediately rising to their feet, every greeting polished in advance, and this was the first time anyone had ever made him wait. When she finished writing the final line and looked up, their eyes met, and Ronan waited for the familiar startle, the sudden stiffness of someone realizing that Ronan Gallagher stood before them. It didn't come. The young woman merely gave him a small nod in greeting, lowered her voice, and said that the patient had only been asleep for an hour, and that if he wished to visit, he should wait until morning. Then she returned to her notebook as though the most powerful man in the city were nothing more than a guest who had arrived at the wrong hour. Ronan asked whether she knew who he was, not out of wounded pride but out of genuine curiosity, and Tessa replied without looking up that she did, that he was the man who paid her salary, while the old man sleeping in that bed was the person whose care she had accepted responsibility for. And inside a patient's room, responsibility came before salary. He remained silent for a moment, then asked in a lower voice whether she wasn't afraid of him, because everyone who entered this house was afraid. This time she lifted her eyes and looked directly at him, with the weary gaze of someone who had stayed awake through too many night shifts, and answered with a calmness that made her words twice as heavy, saying that a person who was about to lose everything didn't have much left to fear. Mr. Gallagher. Ronan didn't ask, but during the 4 days he remained at the mansion, he began to notice something that unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. Everyone in the house performed around him. His wife performed the role of a wife, the guests performed the role of friends, and his men performed the role of loyalty. Only the night nurse performed nothing at all. She simply did her work, and because of that, she was the only real person in a house filled with people. On the final night before his flight, he stopped by his uncle's room once more and met her in the hallway just as she had finished her shift. Out of courtesy, he asked how the old man was doing. Tessa answered with the precise brevity of a medical professional, then hesitated for half a second and added something that would never appear in any chart, that his heartbeat was stronger than the records suggested, and that the house itself was what seemed to be growing weak. Ronan paused and was about to ask what she meant, but she had already lowered her head in farewell and walked toward the servants' staircase, leaving those words lodged in his chest throughout the 16-hour flight back to Singapore, though he couldn't understand why. Tessa hadn't spoken those words without reason. 1 week earlier, while checking the medicine cabinet at the beginning of her shift, as she always did, she discovered that the strength listed on the patient's heart medication didn't match the surgeon's prescription. The difference was small enough that an ordinary person wouldn't have noticed, yet significant enough that an intensive care nurse couldn't ignore it. She brought the matter to the lady of the house, Mrs. Camille, who received her in the drawing room with a perfect smile and a smooth explanation that perhaps the pharmacist had delivered the wrong batch, that Tessa shouldn't worry, because medication in this house had always been personally managed by her. Tessa thanked her politely and nodded, but her mother, who had also been a nurse, had taught her daughter something before she had ever taught her how to hold a stethoscope, that in this profession, one could believe what another person said, but medication could only be administered according to what was written in the records. So from that day forward, she quietly compared every pill against the hospital's original prescription, gave only the exact dose the doctor had ordered, and recorded everything in her handwritten monitoring notebook: the date, the time, the strength, the heartbeat, before and after each dose, every line written carefully by someone who had been taught that caution was a form of kindness. She didn't know that beneath that roof, her carefulness was standing in the path of a plan that had already reached its halfway point, and that every line she wrote was both a heartbeat saved and another line in the sentence that was about to be handed down against her. By the 12th week, the Singapore deal was complete, and Ronan returned to Chicago for good, bringing with him a suitcase full of documents and the habit of working past midnight in his study, so the light in the mansion's western wing now often burned at the same time as the light in the sick room in the eastern wing, two people awake beneath the same roof without knowing they were guarding opposite ends of the same truth. Cormac's health improved with each passing week. He could sit up on his own, had demanded his chessboard, and had begun complaining about the bland porridge in the way sick people do when they know they are going to live. Every evening, he used sleeplessness as an excuse to keep the nurse beside him for another 10 minutes or so, sometimes telling her about the ship that had carried his parents away from Ireland, sometimes asking about the younger sister she was putting through college, and Tessa realized that after a shift, she told this old man things she had never told anyone else. That night, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, the tray had run out of the mild sedative Cormac sometimes needed, while his sleeplessness had not. So Tessa went downstairs to the reserve medicine cabinet near the eastern wing, the shortest route past the small chapel, the only room in the mansion that Mrs. Brennan had told her on her very first night had no cameras, because of the founder's rule that no one was permitted to watch a person making a confession. The corridor was dark, lit only by the dim night lamps casting their glow along the base of the walls, and as Tessa passed the chapel's heavy wooden door, she heard voices. She stopped by instinct, not because she meant to listen, but because she was surprised. At 2 o'clock in the morning, who could still be praying? Then she realized it wasn't a prayer. It was Mrs. Camille's voice, low and urgent, speaking to a man, and through the thick door Tessa could hear only broken pieces of their conversation. The man's deep voice reassuring her about something. Mrs. Camille cutting him off, and then one complete sentence slipped through the gap beneath the door, so clear that even months later Tessa could still hear it inside her mind. It only needs to be announced before the old man's birthday. Tessa stood motionless in the corridor, her heart beating faster though she didn't understand why. The instincts of someone who had spent her life saving others told her there was something wrong in those words. But reason reminded her that this was her employer's home, and the affairs of the family weren't the concern of a nurse. She stepped back, intending to take another route, and at that exact moment, the toe of her shoe touched a small object lying on the stone floor just outside the chapel door. She bent down and picked it up. It was a white gold cufflink, heavy and cold in her palm, with a single letter P engraved across its face in an old-fashioned script. Tessa didn't think much of it. If someone in the house had dropped something, it should be returned to someone in the house. She slipped the cufflink into the pocket of her uniform, took the longer route to the medicine cabinet, collected the exact dose she needed, and returned to the sick room, where the old man was waiting beside a chessboard with the game still unfinished. She didn't tell him what she had heard, partly because she didn't want a heart patient burdened with worry, and partly because she still couldn't name the things she herself should have been worried about. The following morning, when her shift ended, Tessa found Mrs. Brennan in the kitchen, placed the cufflink on the table, and explained that she had found it the night before in the corridor of the eastern wing, asking the housekeeper to return it to its owner because she didn't know whom it belonged to. The housekeeper looked at the cufflink, and Tessa caught something passing across the face of the woman who had worked in that house for 30 years. Not surprise, but something close to recognition. Before Mrs. Brennan quickly tucked it into the pocket of her apron. At that precise moment, Mrs. Camille passed the kitchen doorway. The mistress of the house slowed by half a step, her eyes sweeping across the white gold cufflink in the housekeeper's hand, before rising to meet Tessa's gaze for exactly half a second, no longer, accompanied by a perfectly polite smile, before she continued toward the drawing room as though nothing had happened. Tessa lowered her head in greeting and didn't understand. Camille understood far too well. She walked the length of the corridor without changing her pace, one hand resting lightly on the banister, and only when the door to her private room closed behind her did that perfect face begin to crack, revealing what lay beneath it. The cufflink didn't frighten her. Men dropped things. It was a small matter, something a single lie could erase. What made Camille's hand turn cold against the doorknob was another image entirely. The night nurse, with the hardbound notebook she carried everywhere. The nurse who had once sat in this very drawing room, polite and direct, asking why the strength of the heart medication in the cabinet didn't match the doctor's prescription. A person who kept careful records was a witness. And the most dangerous kind of witness was one who didn't yet know what she was witnessing, because no one could bribe a person who didn't know she possessed something worth selling. Camille stood before the mirror for a long time, watching the woman reflected there arrange every feature back into its proper place. And when she finally lifted the telephone and called her mother, her voice had become smooth as velvet once again. "Mother, I think it is time our family paid closer attention to Uncle Cormac's medication. I have heard that lately, a few things in the medicine cabinet haven't been counted as carefully as they should be." The blow fell on a Tuesday morning, less than a week after that half-second glance at the kitchen doorway, and it was arranged with such precision that whenever Tessa remembered it afterward, a chill ran down her spine. Ronan had left the city 2 days earlier for a brief business trip to the East Coast, the final journey needed to close the deal, and the house was without the only man who might have asked the difficult questions. As usual, Tessa arrived before her shift to receive the handover, and the moment she stepped through the side entrance, Mrs. Brennan met her with an expression Tessa had never seen on the face of that composed woman, the expression of someone who wanted to say something but wasn't permitted to speak. In the grand drawing room, Mrs. Camille stood beside a woman in her 50s, wearing an ivory silk suit, her hair swept into an immaculate updo, without a single strand out of place. Someone Tessa had seen visit for tea several times before, the mistress's mother, Mrs. Lorraine Draven. On the long wooden table, someone had already placed Tessa's nursing bag, the bag she always kept in the staff locker, with its zipper open, and beside it lay 2 objects arranged neatly on a white cloth, like evidence in a courtroom. An unopened vial of morphine bearing the label from the controlled medication cabinet, and a gold pocket watch engraved with the Gallagher family crest, the heirloom that had always rested inside the glass case in the gallery. Tessa looked at those 2 objects, then at her bag, and for the first moment, she didn't even feel afraid. She felt only emptiness, like someone missing a step in the dark, because her trained mind understood the entire structure of the trap before her heart had time to understand that she was the prey. She said that she had never touched those things. Mrs. Lorraine smiled, and that smile was more frightening than any shout could have been, then spoke in the polished, courteous voice shaped by 30 years of charity teas, saying, "My dear Miss Marlowe, no one here wishes to make a scandal of this. This family has endured enough public attention, so we won't call the police. Consider that the final act of mercy we are extending to you, to preserve both your dignity and the dignity of this house. But of course," she continued while pouring herself tea as though they were discussing flowers, "we have a moral obligation to report the matter to the State Board of Nursing. You understand? Procedures are procedures." Tessa asked to speak, asked to compare the shift records, asked for the security footage to be reviewed, and every word she offered struck a wall wrapped in velvet. The cameras in the staff corridor had unfortunately malfunctioned that week. The shift records were private family documents. And young lady, the more you struggle, the uglier this will become. Tessa made one final request. "Let me say goodbye to Mr. Cormack, just for 1 minute." For the first time that morning, Mrs. Camille spoke, her voice gentle and final like a blade wrapped in silk, saying that the doctor had ordered a recent heart surgery patient to avoid all stress. "You are a nurse. You should understand that better than anyone. Or would you like his heartbeat to become your next victim?" They took her access card from her there at the table, while Mrs. Brennan was ordered to stand and watch, her aging hands clenched tightly together beneath her apron. What followed moved as quickly as a machine that had already been oiled and prepared. By the end of that week, the State Board of Nursing sent notice that her license had been suspended during the investigation. At the beginning of the next week, her former hospital called in an apologetic voice to say that they were forced to suspend her employment. Then, every other hospital to which she applied answered with the same kind of silence, the silence of places that had received a certain telephone call, and as though the timing had been arranged. The finance company holding Piper's debt sent a demand for immediate payment of the entire balance, on the grounds that the guarantor no longer had a stable income. Somewhere within it all came a carefully worded warning over the telephone from a debt collection employee, telling her that she should know her place, that she was fortunate no one had prosecuted her for stealing controlled substances. Inside the mansion, the old man was told that the nurse had been caught stealing his medication, and when Cormack roared that he wanted to see her, demanded the evidence, demanded to make a telephone call, every request struck the same shield. Doctor's orders. No stress for a man recovering from heart surgery. A new nurse, personally selected by Mrs. Camille, took over the shifts. The list of people permitted to enter his room was reduced to only a few names, and his telephone was put away so that he could rest and recover more quickly. Ronan returned home on Friday evening, exhausted from the flight, and Camille met him in the foyer wearing exactly the right measure of sorrow. She told him the first version of the story, the vial of morphine in the nursing bag, the family heirloom in the drawer. Such a terrible shame. I trusted her so completely. Thank goodness my mother handled everything discreetly to protect the dignity of our family. And Ronan, a man who could smell a fraudulent clause hidden within 400 pages of a contract, believed his wife, because he was tired, because every document laid before him appeared to fit, and because in 6 years he had never been given a reason to suspect that the greatest stage his wife had ever built stood directly beneath the roof of his own home. He asked only one question: "How is my uncle?" And when he was told that the old man was fine, Ronan picked up a pen and signed the internal order Camille had already prepared, prohibiting Tessa Marlowe from returning to the mansion grounds under any circumstances. That signature took less than 3 seconds. On Sunday afternoon, Tessa came to the iron gates one final time, not to ask for her job back, but only to leave the old man a handwritten letter saying that she hadn't done what they claimed and reminding him to take his medication on time. The new gatekeeper accepted the letter through the bars, looked at her with the eyes people reserved for thieves, and tore it in half in front of her, following the orders he had been given. Rain began to fall. Tessa remained there for a little while longer, rainwater streaming down her face until it could no longer be distinguished from anything else, looking through the iron bars toward the illuminated window in the eastern wing, where an old man was being lied to, and where the notebook she had accidentally left behind in the nursing desk still waited because she hadn't been allowed to retrieve it. Then she turned away and walked toward the bus stop, carrying with her the one thing they hadn't been able to confiscate, the truth no one had allowed her to speak. Many weeks passed, and life inside the mansion returned to its polished order. But some things were like grains of sand inside a shoe, not enough to make a person fall, yet enough to make every step uncomfortable. The first came from the family's accounting department. A single line in the monthly expense report that Ronan noticed while reviewing every number out of habit. Nurse Marlowe's final month's compensation hadn't been paid because the recipient hadn't come to collect it and hadn't responded to any emails. Ronan remained on that line longer than necessary. He had known every kind of thief in his life, those who stole small things and those who stole entire companies, and they all shared one trait. None of them refused money. A woman desperate enough to steal morphine and sell it had walked away from a month's salary worth 3 times what she earned at the hospital. Money she had every legal right to receive. It didn't fit, and things that didn't fit disturbed Ronan in the same way a crooked painting disturbed a collector. The second came one evening as he passed his uncle's room. The door was partially open, and he heard the old man speaking from inside, whether to Ronan or to the emptiness. He couldn't tell, his voice rough and slow. That girl never wrote down a single number incorrectly. Someone who recorded every heartbeat accurately doesn't steal medicine. Ronan stopped in the corridor. He wanted to enter and ask questions, but the new nurse closed the door with the familiar reminder that the patient needed rest, and Ronan allowed himself to be pushed away. Just as everyone in this house allowed themselves to be pushed by doctor's orders no one ever verified. But the words remained. The third was a question that grew inside his mind during a sleepless night, so simple that he was angry with himself for not asking it sooner. Why hadn't anyone called the police? This family had never hesitated to involve the police when they were useful, and the theft of a controlled substance was a criminal matter. There were procedures, fingerprints, records showing every item entering and leaving the medication cabinet. All the things that could have proven the culprit's guilt within 3 days. Yet they had chosen the quietest path. A professional disciplinary board where everything was decided on paper and no one's fingerprints were taken. Ronan sat in his study at 3 o'clock in the morning, slowly turning a cup of cold coffee, and said to himself the sentence he would later repeat to Emmett. A person who has truly been robbed calls the police. A person who has staged the theft calls a disciplinary board. The next morning, he summoned Emmett Doyle, a 45-year-old man who had been uncovering the truth for the Gallagher family since Ronan's father's time, the only person in the organization permitted to deliver bad news without sweetening it first. Ronan gave him a brief order. Reconstruct the entire Marlowe nurse incident. Do it quietly. No one can know, including anyone inside this house. When Emmett questioned him with his eyes, asking whether his employer meant even the lady of the house, Ronan answered only that he didn't suspect anyone. He simply hated things that made no sense, and there were 3 contradictions in this house wearing the same story. Emmett worked like an old craftsman, leaving no seam untouched. The cameras in the staff corridor had been reported broken during the exact week of the incident, but Emmett knew something the person who reported the failure didn't know. 2 years earlier, after an information leak, Ronan himself had ordered a separate backup storage system installed, and only 3 people in the entire organization knew its password. The backup footage was still there, and in it, on the evening before the evidence was discovered, Camille Gallagher, the mistress of the house, entered the staff locker area, a place she hadn't had any reason to visit during the 6 years she had lived in the mansion, stood in front of Nurse Marlowe's locker for exactly 90 seconds, and opened the zipper of the nursing bag with a hand covered by a silk glove. Emmett watched the footage 4 times before bringing it to Ronan, and he placed the tablet on the study desk without saying a word, because 30 years in his profession had taught him that some truths had to be seen with one's own eyes. Ronan watched it once. He didn't replay it. His expression didn't change. Only the knuckles of the hand resting on the desk slowly turned white. Then he spoke, his voice low and level like the surface of a lake before a storm. "Keep pulling. This thread is longer." And Emmett pulled. The silk glove led to the question of where the mistress had obtained the key to the controlled medication cabinet. The key led to the person who held the only duplicate outside the nurse on duty. That led to the family's medication purchasing process, which had been arranged by a law office, and the name of that office made the thin thread suddenly tighten into a chain, following the money paid for private medical services. Emmett discovered regular payments flowing from the family's operating fund into a health consulting company registered in another state, a company with no employees and no real office, only a bank account and a legal representative concealed behind 3 layers of authorization documents. When he finally peeled away the last layer, the name that appeared forced Emmett to verify it through 3 independent sources before he dared place it in the report. Preston Vaughn, chief counsel to the Gallagher family, the man who still dined at the mansion once every week and called Ronan his brother. Preston Vaughn's name had been lying on the study desk for 3 days when Ronan remembered the notebook. He remembered the first night he met the nurse, the image of her hand writing steady lines in the hardbound notebook resting on her lap, and he summoned Mrs. Brennan and asked only one question: whether the belongings Miss Marlowe had left behind were still there. The housekeeper remained silent for 1 beat longer than usual, then said that no one had cleared out the nursing desk in the former sick room, and there was something in the way she spoke that made Ronan understand that no one had cleared it out, not because anyone had forgotten, but because an old pair of hands had quietly made sure it wouldn't be touched. The notebook lay at the bottom of the drawer, its dark blue hardcover worn at the corners, and Ronan carried it back to his study, locked the door, sat down, and read it as though he were reading a contract that would decide the fate of his entire family. because it turned out that was exactly what it was. The pages were filled with the careful handwriting of someone who had been taught that caution was a form of kindness. Every night shift occupied a page. His uncle's heartbeat at 10 o'clock at night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, at 4 o'clock in the morning, his blood pressure, the dosage of every medication, his sleep, even the small notes in the margins saying that the old man had demanded his chessboard, that he had told stories about the ship, that he had laughed. Ronan turned each page and watched his uncle come back to life night after night through the ink of a stranger who had guarded him more carefully than his own blood. Then he reached the pages that seemed to lower the temperature of the room by several degrees. Beginning in the 7th week, a comparison column appeared beside the medical readings. The strength of the heart medication written on the surgeon's prescription and the actual strength of the batch stored in the cabinet. The two numbers didn't match. Beside them was a note saying that the mistress of the house had been questioned and had explained that the pharmacist had delivered the wrong batch, followed by a line underlined in darker ink. Administer only according to the original prescription. Verify every pill before each shift. Ronan sat motionless for a long time, and inside the mind of a man raised to recognize the structure of every game, the scattered pieces of the past several weeks began to fit together into a complete and chilling picture. Someone had switched his uncle's medication, not to kill him, because death left a body in questions, but to make the old man weaker, more exhausted, more confused, until one day his hand would tremble as he signed documents transferring power that he could no longer read. And that day had already been chosen. It only needs to be announced before the old man's birthday. But the plan had encountered something no one had anticipated. A provincial nurse with the habit of comparing every pill against the original prescription. And throughout the time she remained on duty, the old man hadn't grown weaker at all. He had become stronger with every passing week, demanding his chessboard, demanding seasoned food, laughing aloud. That was why she had to be removed. And she had to be removed in the cruelest possible way. Simply firing her wouldn't be enough, because she would still have a voice. Her credibility had to be destroyed. She had to be turned into a nurse who stole medication, because no court, no board, and no person would ever trust the records of a thief. Every line she had written would die along with her reputation. Tessa Marlowe hadn't been framed because of a cufflink. She had been framed because she had kept her records too carefully. Ronan closed the notebook, and at that exact moment, Emmett knocked on the door, carrying the second file Ronan had requested the week before, the remainder of the chain. He placed it on the desk, and for the first time in 30 years of delivering bad news, the man spoke before opening the file. "You should sit down before you look at this, sir." Inside were photographs spanning the 11 weeks Ronan had spent in Singapore, and even the time before that. Camille and Preston in the corridor of a hotel in the center of the city. Camille entering an apartment building registered to a shell company. Preston's car parked in the garage of that building in photographs taken through all 4 seasons. And the final page wasn't a photograph, but a copy of a medical record from a discreet private maternity clinic, issued under a woman's maiden name, Camille Draven, nearly 14 weeks pregnant. Ronan looked at that number, and the mind that never stopped counting automatically worked backward to the weeks when he had been half a world away from home. Then he stood, walked to the wall behind his desk, opened a private safe whose contents even his wife had never seen, and removed a sealed medical file that had been sleeping there for 5 years, ever since the accident when he was 29, a file bearing the signatures of 2 leading specialists, and a conclusion he had never shared with anyone, not even the woman he had married, because in his world, a weakness spoken aloud became a weakness that could be used. The conclusion stated that his chances of fathering a child were almost non-existent. He placed the sealed file beside the pregnancy report, the 2 documents lying next to each other on the wooden desk. One was the foundation of his wife's entire plan for an heir. The other was the thing that had caused that foundation to collapse before the first brick was ever laid, and she had no idea. Ronan didn't break anything. Not a single glass left its tray, and not one sound escaped through the study door that night. He simply sat down, opened the nurse's blue notebook to its first page, placed it on his left, arranged Emmett's photographs on his right, left the sealed medical file between them, and began reading everything again from the beginning, slowly, 1 line at a time, the way a man takes inventory before a great reckoning. In this city, people still said that in Ronan Gallagher's world, when he fell silent and began to count, it meant someone's time had run out. That night, behind the locked door of his study, Ronan began to count. Finding Tessa Marlowe wasn't difficult for a man like Emmett. The difficult part was that what he found reduced the report to a single page that Ronan had to read 3 times. The young woman had left her old apartment because she could no longer afford the rent after losing her job and had moved into a small room on the outskirts of the city. After 4 months of rejection from every hospital because her name had been placed on a blacklist, she accepted a night shift position as a care aide at a suburban nursing home, work that didn't require a professional license, paid half a nurse's salary, and consisted of cleaning, lifting patients, and changing bed linens. Tasks now performed in silence by hands that had once guarded the heartbeats of an entire intensive care unit. Ronan drove there himself on a Thursday night, without a driver or bodyguards, parked across the street, and walked into the aging building behind a fence with peeling paint. Through the glass window of the common room, he saw her before she saw him. Tessa was sitting beside an elderly woman with silver-white hair who had fallen asleep in her wheelchair, and beneath the dim yellow light, he watched her do something no care aide was paid to do. She gently took the old woman's wrist, lowered her eyes to the small watch pinned to her chest, moved her lips as she counted, then wrote something on a piece of paper folded into quarters, and tucked it into her pocket, because the habits of someone who had once been a nurse couldn't simply be abandoned, and because the elderly people in this place, with no children or grandchildren, had no one else to count anything for them. Ronan stood outside the glass, watching her, the man who had viewed the footage of his own wife framing someone without changing expression, and felt his chest tighten in a way he couldn't name. When Tessa pushed the wheelchair into the hallway and saw him, she stopped. She didn't startle or step back. She merely straightened her spine, like someone preparing to receive another blow, and asked in a calm voice, worn empty of emotion, whether Mr. Gallagher had come to make certain she stayed away from his house, or whether there was still somewhere her name hadn't been blacklisted. Ronan said that he had come because he knew the truth. She looked at him for a long time, and he waited for tears, anger, accusations. But all that came was a very soft breath, like someone lowering a backpack filled with stones, after carrying it over a road that had been far too long. Then she said, "So now you know," and began to push the wheelchair forward again because the old woman needed to be back in her room before it was time for her medication. He followed her and said that he would compensate her for everything. Every loss, the debt, the months without work, any amount she named, he would sign. Tessa stopped the wheelchair in the middle of the hallway and turned to look directly into his eyes for the first time that night, with the eyes of the woman who had once stood in the rain outside the iron gates of his home and spoke each word slowly and clearly. "I don't need you to buy my dignity back for me. I need the person who took it to return it to the place where it belongs." Ronan remained silent, and she continued, her voice no louder, though every word struck like a needle. "Do you know where that place is? It is the State Board of Nursing, where they are holding my license with the word theft beside my name. It is every hospital that received some telephone call. It is my sister, who had to hear people whisper that her older sister was a thief. Dignity doesn't live inside a bank account, sir. So your money can't reach the place where mine has been imprisoned." Then she lowered her voice. "And it was that lowering of her voice that became the sharpest blade," she said. "And I remember the signature on the order forbidding me from returning. The gatekeeper showed it to me before he tore up my letter. You believed them too, without asking me a single question." The nursing home hallway was so quiet that the ancient heater could be heard breathing at the far end. Ronan Gallagher, a man who had never bowed his head before anyone still living, stood there and accepted every word, without denial, without explanation, without using his wife as a shield, because he understood that some signatures took 3 seconds, and some debts took a lifetime to repay. He only said, "You are right. I signed without asking. That was my failure, and I am not asking you to erase it. I am asking you for only one thing. Don't sign for any money. Don't agree to remain silent with anyone who comes to you. And wait for me, because your dignity will be returned to the exact place you just named, to the very table of that board, publicly and completely, together with the names of the people who took it from you. I don't promise it will be quick. I promise it will be complete." Tessa looked at the most powerful man in the city standing in the peeling hallway of a nursing home, and for the first time since that Tuesday morning, something very small stirred inside her chest, something she had believed they had confiscated, along with her access card and her professional license. She didn't say whether she believed him. She only nodded once, then pushed the wheelchair toward the end of the hallway, while Ronan stood watching until the white uniform disappeared around the corner. That night, as he drove home, he didn't turn on the music or make a telephone call. He simply drove in silence through the sleeping city, and from that night onward, the debt inside him had two layers. One bore the name of his uncle, the man being slowly poisoned inside his own home. The other bore the name of that young woman, whom Ronan himself, with a signature that took 3 seconds, had helped push into the abyss while she was protecting the life of the only family he had left. Camille chose a Saturday dinner to announce the news. The dining table was lit with candles. The main course was the dish Ronan had eaten since the early days of their marriage, and when the servants withdrew, she placed a hand over her stomach with an expression of hesitation she had practiced in front of the mirror no fewer than 3 times, and said that she had something to tell him. They were going to have a child. With another husband, that moment would have required tears, an embrace, at least a smile. But Camille hadn't married another husband. She had married Ronan Gallagher, so when he set down his knife and fork, looked at her for 3 seconds, then nodded and said the family needed this news, she noticed nothing unusual. On the contrary, she felt relieved, because 6 years of living with this man had taught her that coldness was his truest signature. The colder he was, the more believable he became, and one nod from Ronan was worth more than 100 congratulations from anyone else. She added in a voice soft as silk that she wanted to make the announcement at Uncle Cormac's 70th birthday celebration before the entire family, so that the joy might help him recover. Ronan lifted his wineglass, turned it slowly, and told her to arrange it, that she and her mother could decide the guest list, because he had been occupied lately with the restructuring of several companies. Not one word of that sentence differed from the man he had always been, and that was precisely what made it the perfect disguise, because he wasn't pretending to be a happy husband, a role he wouldn't have known how to play. He was simply performing the same cold version of himself everyone saw each day, and no one examines something that looks exactly like the truth. From that day forward, the mansion moved along 2 parallel timelines. The first was loud and fragrant with flowers. Camille and Mrs. Lorraine sat with the event planners, chose the menu, selected the music, and prepared a guest list that included every important relative and 2 senior associates of the family. During the afternoon telephone calls between mother and daughter, the plan was secured 1 step at a time. The pregnancy would be announced at the exact moment everyone raised their glasses to honor the old man, so that Cormac would be overwhelmed before the entire family and left with no choice but to offer his blessing. Then, carried forward by that momentum, within 1 month they would have him sign the executive authorization documents Preston had prepared long ago, perfectly legal papers with all the proper witnesses, a transfer of power without a single gunshot. Mrs. Lorraine ended one call with what she believed was the wisest sentence she had ever spoken. Let the old man be happy. Happy people sign more easily. The second timeline moved in absolute silence. Judith Kane, a 50-year-old attorney with a voice as dry as the documents she handled, who had represented Ronan personally since before his marriage, began assembling the case in an office outside the family's building. The divorce petition, the asset records, and Emmett's chain of evidence were duplicated and stored in 3 separate locations. While reviewing the ownership documents, she discovered something even Ronan had forgotten. The mansion beside Lake Michigan wasn't part of the family's shared property as everyone believed. It had been purchased through the inheritance fund his mother left him and had remained registered to that fund ever since, which meant that legally, every wall, every corridor, and every room in that house belonged to Ronan alone. He had complete authority to do whatever he wished inside it, including turning it into whatever he wanted it to become. Judith delivered the news in a single sentence over a secure line. The house belongs to you, not to them. At the other end of the call, Ronan stood looking through the study window toward the lake for a very long time. During those same weeks, he did something that appeared in none of Judith's files. Through 2 layers of intermediary companies, the entire medical debt in Piper Marlowe's name was purchased from the collection agency by another party. The interest was immediately frozen. Every collection call stopped from that moment onward, and on paper, the new creditor was only an anonymous company name the Marlowe sisters would never be able to trace. He remembered Tessa telling him that his money couldn't reach the place where her dignity had been imprisoned, so he quietly removed the noose from the necks of both sisters and reserved the restoration of her dignity for another kind of repayment. The final days before the celebration passed in a state of perfection so complete it was almost frightening. Florists came and went. The menu received its final approval. Camille tried on dresses before the mirror 3 times and chose a cream-colored one that emphasized the curves now beginning to show on a woman nearly 6 months pregnant. Preston sent flowers wishing Uncle Cormac good health, accompanied by a carefully written card worthy of a devoted nephew. Mrs. Lorraine ordered invitations printed with the family monogram, and all of them moved with the confidence of chess pieces that believed they were the players. Not one of them knew that in the mansion's western wing, behind the locked door of the study, a safe held a sealed medical file 5 years old, and the man who possessed the key still sat alone every night, reading the blue-covered notebook of a nurse and comparing every date on the calendar with every step of their plan, patient as a watchmaker waiting for the pendulum to reach the precise point of descent. The birthday celebration they had so carefully prepared as the stage for their coronation, he had decided would become their courtroom, and the invitations had been sent by their own hands. The letter arrived one afternoon just after Tessa finished her shift, lying in the mailbox of her rented room among several advertisements, inside a thick white envelope with no sender's name, no return address, and a postmark from a district she had never visited. She opened it at the kitchen table and sat motionless for 10 minutes. Inside was a copy of the inventory record for the mansion's controlled medication cabinet, signed to confirm that every item was accounted for and dated 1 day after the morphine vial had been found in her bag, which meant the evidence had appeared in her bag before the medication cabinet had even reported anything missing, a fatal contradiction that only someone with access to the household's original records could have known. Along with it was a copy of the pharmacy delivery receipt, showing that the batch of heart medication with the incorrect strength hadn't been sent by mistake at all, but had been specially ordered through an additional purchase request, approved with the signature of the mistress of the house. Finally, there was a sheet of white paper folded in half, with only one sentence written across it in careful slanting handwriting. "You once guarded the heartbeat of this house. Now it is time for this house to beat again for you." By the 10th time Tessa read those words, she realized that her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar feeling of someone drowning who had suddenly touched a hand without knowing whose it was. She immediately thought of Ronan, because who else could it be? Who else in that house both knew the truth and had the authority to touch the original records, and the thought made her angry in a way she couldn't name. If it was him, why hide his identity? Why promise to restore everything publicly and properly, only to come through the back door as though the truth were some charitable gift? The following evening, she went to the address of the transportation company the newspapers always mentioned when writing about the Gallagher family's effort to become legitimate, waited in the parking lot until nearly 10 o'clock at night, and when Ronan emerged with Emmett, she walked directly toward him, pulled out the white envelope, held it up, and asked without greeting him whether he had sent it. Ronan took it and read every page beneath the parking lot lights, while Tessa watched his face the way a nurse watched a patient, searching beneath the skin for a genuine reaction. She saw his eyes pause on the inventory record, saw his jaw tighten at the delivery receipt, and then saw something she hadn't expected. Real surprise, the kind even the finest actor couldn't perform. He returned the envelope and said that it hadn't come from him, because if he had sent it, she wouldn't have received it through the mail. Then he remained silent for a moment, before adding more slowly that whoever had sent it knew things that had taken even him many weeks to uncover, and that person was standing on her side from inside the house. The two of them stood in the empty parking lot, looking down at the white envelope, silently passing through every face inside the mansion, and neither of them could find a name that fit the empty space. Who in a house where every loyalty had already been bought or weighed, would still dare to stand quietly beside a nurse branded as a thief? The question remained suspended between them without an answer, and Tessa carried it back to her rented room, placed the envelope beneath her pillow like a small lamp, and for the first time in many months, slept without dreaming of the iron gates. During that same week, on another side of the chessboard, Emmett brought Ronan a discovery he called the loose thread on a garment that was too smooth. Preston Vaughn was careful to the point of suspicion. Every exchange with Camille passed through a self-deleting application, and every movement of money was hidden behind 3 layers. But even the most careful man needed somewhere to store his caution, and Emmett found that place. A second unregistered telephone that was only turned on during Wednesday afternoons at a coffee shop beside a gym. That telephone didn't call Camille. It regularly exchanged messages with a number in New York, belonging to the youngest daughter of a rival family that had fought the Gallaghers for harbor contracts for 2 decades. The frequency and timing of those messages revealed a relationship that had lasted at least 1 year. Running alongside the New York business trips Preston continued to report as meetings with associates. The lawyer was walking two ropes at once. If the plan to seize the Gallagher family succeeded, he would have Camille and the seat of power. If it collapsed, he already had a doorway waiting in New York, through which he could escape while carrying every secret of the Gallagher family as his dowry. Camille, the woman who believed she was holding the strings, was in truth nothing more than a reserve chess piece in another man's pocket. Emmett asked whether the information should be added to the file for Attorney Kane. Ronan stood beside the window looking out over the dark lake, silent for so long that Emmett thought he hadn't heard. Then he turned, and in the man's eyes was a light Emmett had seen only a few times during his 30 years of service to the family. Ronan said no, that it wouldn't go into any file, not Judith's, not anyone's, and ordered him to keep it separately for Ronan alone. Then he looked toward the study door, as though he could see through it into another room within the house, and spoke the final words of that night. The last wall will belong to him. On the final day before the celebration, the house unknowingly cleared the way for Ronan's plan. Following an appointment made 3 weeks earlier, Camille and Mrs. Lorraine went to a resort in the city for skincare treatments, a final dress fitting, and an overnight stay so her complexion could rest before facing the cameras. The event crew wasn't scheduled to arrive and begin setting up until the following morning, so when dusk settled over Lake Michigan, the mansion held only the household staff, and one man who had told his wife he would be occupied with a corporate restructuring meeting until late into the night. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Ronan summoned every member of the staff to the foyer, from the cook to the gardener, and personally handed each of them a sealed envelope along with a brief announcement. The entire household would receive 2 full days of paid leave. Transportation had already been arranged to take everyone home, and for anyone wishing to visit family farther away, the tickets were waiting inside the envelopes. No one was to return before the morning after next. The servants departed amid a murmur of grateful thanks. Only Mrs. Brennan remained until the end. The woman who had spent 30 years hearing even the things the walls didn't say studied her young employer for a long time, studying those gray eyes that were calm in a way that was almost frightening. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask whether he needed help. She simply removed the familiar ring of keys from her waist, placed one key on the table, and said that she would leave the code on her desk. Then she put on her coat and walked out to the car, and at the moment the side door closed behind her, Ronan understood that he had just received the closest thing to a blessing that this house still possessed. At 9 o'clock that night, Emmett's unmarked van backed through the rear gates, carrying sealed cardboard boxes that the 2 men unloaded and carried inside with their own hands, without hiring another person to assist them. And the work began. Ronan worked the same way he negotiated, slowly, precisely, without a single unnecessary movement. The grand foyer came first, the place where every guest would take the first step into the house and lift their eyes toward the crystal chandelier. On the most prominent wall opposite the main entrance, he placed the largest enlargement, smoothing every corner flat with both palms like a museum worker mounting a painting, so that anyone crossing the threshold would be forced to see it before they had the chance to notice anything else. The staircase came next, and there he did what people would later describe as the coldest detail of that night. He arranged the photographs in chronological order, one image on every step, with the date clearly printed beneath each one, so the betrayal climbed the staircase one step at a time, just as it had climbed through the months, and anyone wishing to reach the second floor would be forced to walk beside the entire timeline. There was no shortcut, just as there had been no shortcut for him through 6 years of marriage. He remained longest in the gallery, beneath the stern portraits of his ancestors in their gilded frames, the men and women who had built this family with nothing but their bare hands and a ship that carried them away from Ireland. He carefully displayed every invoice, every transfer order, and every account statement showing how the family's money had flowed into the shell company. Each document was aligned beneath the gaze of an ancestor, so that those who had sweated to build the fortune could look directly upon the people who were hollowing it out. When he reached the chapel, he brought no photographs with him. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, walked past the short rows of pews beneath the dim glow of the sanctuary lamp, and left only one object on the Bible resting at the center of the altar, the white gold cufflink engraved with the letter P that Mrs. Brennan had returned to him along with her account of that morning at the kitchen doorway. Beside it, he placed a folded sheet of paper bearing one handwritten sentence: "God doesn't need photographs." In the office at the end of the second-floor corridor, the room Preston used whenever he came to conduct family business, Ronan locked the door behind him and remained inside for 40 minutes, longer than he had spent in any other room. When he emerged, The wall behind the desk had been completely covered with things that, outside of Ronan and Emmett, no living soul had ever seen. Then, he went to his uncle's room. The old man was sleeping deeply under the effect of a mild sedative, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, and Ronan stood beside the bed for a long time. He placed nothing on these walls, not one photograph and not one sheet of paper. A heart patient didn't need another blade driven into him. He only needed the truth placed within reach. Ronan took the blue-covered notebook with its worn corners from the inside pocket of his coat and set it neatly on the bedside table, in the same place where it had once rested every night while the nurse sat on duty, so that the following morning, when Cormac awoke amid the commotion that would surely come, he would only need to reach out and touch the handwriting of the one person who had guarded his heartbeat, while the entire house guarded his fortune. There was one final room Ronan entered, and left with empty hands: the kitchen. He stood among the cold stone counters where, 30 years earlier, his mother had kneaded dough every Sunday morning and taught her young son that waiting for bread to rise required patience. He decided that this place would bear no trace of the betrayal. Some memories couldn't be allowed to become poisoned, not even by a single piece of paper. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the empty cardboard boxes were loaded back into the van, and Emmett departed through the rear gates. Ronan made one final circuit of the house, straightened a frame that hung half a centimeter crooked at the foot of the staircase, placed a large envelope on the console table in the center of the foyer, then switched off the lights one section at a time, like someone lowering the curtain before a performance. He sent his wife a brief message, saying that his return flight had been delayed and that he would arrive in the middle of the celebration. Across the city, inside a resort room scented with essential oils, Camille read the message, smiled, and set her telephone aside, thinking that her husband's absence during the first half of the evening would only make things easier. Her stage needed that empty space. At dawn, while Lake Michigan was still gray as cold steel, a black car left the mansion and carried Ronan Gallagher to the airport. And behind him, the silent house waited in the light of morning, every wall having already memorized its part. The sound of tires grinding over the gravel outside the gates cut through everything. Camille was still standing in the middle of the foyer with the medical file in her hands. Preston still hadn't recovered from the shock of the wall inside the office. He had rushed upstairs to see on his own trembling legs, and both of them realized a truth as simple as it was merciless. The celebration could no longer be cancelled. The invitations bearing the family monogram had been sent 3 weeks earlier. The guests had already arrived, and there wasn't a single servant left in the house to send out and block the gates, not one pair of hands to tear the photographs down in time. The house had been abandoned to the truth for one full night, and now the truth refused to give it back. Camille lunged toward the nearest photograph on the foyer wall and tried to rip it down, her fingernails scraping against the adhesive that held it perfectly flat. But only one corner of the photograph tore away, revealing an identical second print mounted beneath it. The person who had hung the photographs had anticipated even this desperate movement of her hand. She stood there holding the torn piece of photographic paper and understood that she was trapped inside a chessboard where every move had already been made on her behalf the night before. The front doors opened. An aunt of the family entered first with her husband, and the cheerful words on their lips died as abruptly as though they had been cut away with scissors. Then came the 2 senior associates, the family always called honored guests, men who had sat through every kind of negotiation imaginable, and even they, men who believed they had seen everything the world could show them, stopped frozen at the threshold, with the birthday gift still tied in its ribbon between their hands. Their eyes moved from the enormous photograph in the center of the foyer to the woman nearly 6 months pregnant standing beneath it, then to the chief counsel descending the staircase with a face as white as a blank sheet of paper. A younger relative entered last, still laughing at an unfinished story on his telephone, looked up, and the smile remained trapped on his face like something forgotten there. No one removed a coat, no one set down a gift. The grand foyer was filled with people, yet it was so silent that the steady breathing of the air conditioning above could be heard, because there are some sights for which etiquette has never written a response. Then the sound of a cane striking the stone floor came from the doorway, slow and even, one beat at a time, and the crowd parted like water. Cormac Gallagher entered the house bearing his family's name, exactly 70 years old that day, his back still straight, although his right hand rested his full weight upon the wooden cane. He stopped beneath the crystal chandelier and looked up at the largest photograph for exactly 3 seconds. No longer. Then did the one thing that made the entire foyer hold its breath. He walked toward the staircase. The old man climbed one step at a time, slowly, like a solemn ritual, stopping before every photograph arranged along the timeline, reading each date printed beneath it with the eyes of someone who had spent 70 years learning to read people in order to survive. He didn't speak. His expression didn't change. Only the knuckles gripping the top of the cane grew whiter with each step, while everyone below stood motionless and watched the founder of the family walk the full length of a betrayal, stretching across dozens of stairs on legs that had only recently endured heart surgery. When he returned to the foyer, he stopped before the medical file lying on the stone floor where Camille had dropped it, bent down and picked it up with the deliberate movement of a man who wouldn't allow anyone to do it for him, opened it, and began to read. They watched him read the first page, then the page bearing the signatures of 2 doctors, then lift his head, and that gaze traveled in one unbroken line from the document to the nearly 6-month curve beneath his niece-in-law's cream-colored dress. Camille stepped back half a pace. Then Cormac Gallagher spoke his first words since entering the house, his voice quiet but falling across the stone foyer like a sentence being handed down. The person who meant to surrender the Gallagher name to a lie will explain. No one answered. Preston chose that exact moment to do what men like him always did when the game collapsed. He began retreating toward the corridor, stammering something about calling the bar association, and his legs carried him back upstairs into the familiar office, perhaps to gather documents, perhaps only to hide. But the door opened, and he froze before the wall behind the desk for the second time in his life. This time Camille followed close behind him, because at that moment she refused to let him out of her sight, and over his shoulder she saw what the darkness of the office the night before hadn't allowed her to see completely. Photographs taken in New York. Preston with a young woman Camille had never met, though she immediately recognized the surname of the rival family printed on an event card visible in one of the images. Evenings extending across more than a year. Enlarged messages from a telephone she hadn't known existed. An entire escape route her lover had quietly constructed for himself. Camille stood in the middle of that room and collapsed for the second time within a single hour. The first time, she had been a wife exposed by her husband. This time, she was a woman realizing that she too had been nothing more than a reserve chess piece in the pocket of the man she had sacrificed everything to choose. 2 collapses upon the same walls, arranged by the same hand. She turned toward Preston and was about to speak when his telephone rang. An unknown number. He answered by the instinct of a drowning man, reaching for anything that might keep him afloat. And from the speaker came a woman's voice, clear, dry, and cold as a blade laid against glass. "My name is Judith Kane, legal counsel for Mr. Ronan Gallagher. I am calling to inform you that every document currently displayed inside the property has been duplicated and formally recorded. Any attempt to remove or destroy them will be documented as destruction of evidence. The divorce petition and all related legal claims were filed this morning. From this moment forward, all communication must go through my office. And before you ask, the answer is no. My client is no longer there to carry the consequences of your choices. No one ate birthday cake that night. The 3-tier cake remained untouched inside the kitchen refrigerator while Cormac Gallagher, using the same voice with which he had built this family half a century earlier, ordered everyone bearing the Gallagher name and the 2 senior associates to remain, while the other guests were escorted home with the brief explanation that the family had a matter to resolve. He summoned the family council immediately in the grand dining room, refusing to wait until morning or move the meeting to an office, and he held it beneath the walls still covered with photographs and documents that, under Attorney Kane's instructions, no one was permitted to touch, because the old man wanted every judgment delivered that night to be spoken directly before the evidence, in the same manner trials had been conducted when he still had nothing to his name, by looking straight at the proof and speaking. He sat at the head of the table, his cane resting across the arms of his chair like a scepter, and judged them one at a time without raising his voice once. Preston came first. The lawyer managed exactly 3 sentences: that everything could be explained, that documents could be interpreted in different ways, and that he needed time. Cormac allowed him to finish, listening with the patience of a man who had heard thousands of liars throughout his life, then slowly recited 3 numbers from memory: the account number of the shell company, the amount of money that had passed through it over 2 years, and the number of the provision in the very family charter Preston himself had drafted years earlier, the provision concerning betrayal of trust. Preston fell silent. Cormac declared that every position he held was revoked that very night, and that his access to all documents was terminated. Then the old man did something no one in the room had expected. He turned to the two senior associates and said that the following morning, the entire file concerning the shell company, the fraudulent consulting contracts, and the taxes this gentleman had so skillfully evaded over the years would be delivered to federal prosecutors and the tax authorities, complete and voluntarily, by the family itself, because Cormac Gallagher understood something men like Preston never would, that the harshest punishment for a fox was to throw it to the very hunters it had once outwitted. He ended Preston's judgment with a sentence the entire city would later repeat. A stranger's prison is cleaner than forgiveness inside the family. When Camille's turn came, she could no longer stand without holding the back of a chair, and in one final instinctive movement, she placed both hands around her stomach, as though searching for a shield. Cormac looked at the gesture and slowly shook his head. "Don't do that," he said. "That child isn't your shield, and it will never be your debtor." He ordered the prenuptial agreement read aloud before the council, the same agreement Mrs. Lorraine had once reviewed word by word before the wedding with a satisfied smile, because she believed her daughter would never need it. The document stated clearly that any proven act of betrayal would require the offending party to leave with exactly what they had brought into the marriage, and Camille Draven had entered that house with 2 suitcases of clothing. She would leave before the end of the week, return to her mother's home, and take exactly 2 suitcases with her. Mrs. Lorraine sprang to her feet and reached for the weapons she had always relied upon, her polished voice and her connections. She spoke of charitable foundations, benefactors, and the reputation of their social circle. Cormac listened to everything, then answered with a single question. "Do you believe those benefactors will sit at the same table with the woman who approved an order for the wrong strength of medication for an old man recovering from heart surgery?" The room fell silent, because only then did many of them understand the deepest meaning of the documents displayed in the gallery. Before the following week ended, the 3 largest charitable foundations in the city had each received a resignation letter signed by Lorraine herself, because some doors must be closed by one's own hand before someone else slams them shut. Then, in the middle of that room filled with rigid faces, the 70-year-old man softened his voice for the first time that night and spoke of the only person absent from every wrongdoing, the unborn child. He declared before the entire family, so that every ear would hear and no mouth would ever be permitted to say otherwise, that the child was innocent, that it wouldn't carry the debts of adults, and that no one bearing this family name would ever speak of it with anything but kindness. That very week, the family would establish a fully funded trust to support the child until adulthood, independently managed, so that regardless of what became of the adults, a child soon entering this world would always have food, an education, and enough to begin a life of its own. "This family has done many things in the past that should bring us shame," he said. "But we have never settled accounts with a child, and we never will." The council ended close to 2 o'clock in the morning. One by one, they left through the grand foyer beneath the photographs, still looking down upon them. When the room held only the old man and the housekeeper, who had quietly returned at dusk and stood behind his chair throughout the entire judgment, as she had for 30 years, Cormac finally allowed his shoulders to sink slightly. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and took out the object that had rested there since morning, the blue-covered notebook with its worn corners, the one he had found on his bedside table upon waking, whose pages he had read so many times that he nearly knew them by heart, while the entire house collapsed beyond his door. Then he spoke to Mrs. Brennan in a tired voice that no longer concealed anything. "I need to see the nurse. I owe that girl a trial." 2 days later, a black car stopped in front of the suburban nursing home at the exact hour Tessa finished her morning shift, and the person who stepped out wasn't Ronan but Mrs. Brennan, the woman who opened with the only sentence needed to make Tessa agree to get into the car. "The old man wants to see you, child, and this time no one can stop him." They didn't return to the mansion. The car took her to a small gray stone house on the outskirts of the city, where Cormac had moved temporarily while the house beside the lake remained a formally documented crime scene, and the old man was waiting for her at a tea table by the window, thinner than when she had last seen him, though his eyes were as bright and direct as though there had never been any surgery. Tessa stood in the doorway, and all the things she had planned to say through so many nights suddenly refused to come first, so he was the one who spoke. "Sit down, child. Today, let this old man give his statement first." Then Cormac Gallagher began to tell her everything, slowly and clearly, like someone who had been arranging this testimony for a very long time. He said he had never believed it, not for a single second. On the morning they entered his room and told him that the nurse had been caught stealing medication, he lay there listening and knew immediately that it was a lie, because he was the man whose wrist that young woman held every night while she counted every heartbeat with her mother's old watch. Someone that careful with another person's life would never be careless with her own honor. But as he lay there, he understood something colder at the same time. If they were willing to invent such a shameless story to tear her out of the house, then she must have been standing in the way of something much larger, and that larger thing had something to do with the pills she had once questioned. The old man had overheard that conversation from his bed, even though both women had believed he was asleep. He continued, his voice unchanged, though his fingers tightened together on the tabletop. Think about what I had in my hands at that moment. A heart that had just been cut open, a telephone taken away under doctor's orders, and a list of people allowed into my room approved by the very person behind the scheme. Had I shouted for justice for you that day, without evidence and without allies, they would only have smiled and said the old man had become confused after heart surgery. Then they would have needed only a few more doses before I truly became confused, before I no longer had enough clarity to serve as a witness for anyone, including myself. So I chose the founder's way, the same way that allowed a penniless boy to survive among the most brutal docks 60 years ago. I pretended to lose. In front of the new nurse, he began forgetting people's names, drifting to sleep in the middle of sentences, and allowing his hand to tremble when he held a spoon. He performed exactly the script the people who had switched his medication expected, so they would believe the incorrect strength was doing its work, so they would calmly wait for his 70th birthday, without increasing the dosage, while every evening, the only woman in the world he trusted without condition, Mrs. Brennan, quietly brought the correct medication into his room under his orders, purchased from a pharmacy in another district, and switched the pills back again, replacing their replacement, giving him the real medicine, and hiding the incorrect pills as evidence. She did it every day, throughout the months when the entire house believed he was slowly fading away. And it was also Cormac, through Mrs. Brennan's hands, the hands of the woman who held the keys to every document cabinet in the house, who gathered copies of the inventory records and the pharmacy delivery receipts, one page at a time, then asked her to mail them to Tessa from a distant district, without a signature or any trace, because he didn't know whether the letter would be intercepted, and he didn't know whether she could still trust anyone bearing the Gallagher name. He only knew that she needed to see proof that she wasn't losing her mind, that someone knew the truth. Those words were his. He had dictated them for Mrs. Brennan to write because his hand had been trembling, not from illness, but from rage. Tessa sat listening with both hands folded in her lap, and understood that throughout the months when she had believed herself to be the loneliest person in the world, 2 investigations had been moving through the darkness for her without knowing of each other. One conducted by the younger man in the western wing through backup cameras and financial trails, the other by the old man in the eastern wing through switched blister packs and handwritten copies. 2 tunnels dug from opposite sides of the same mountain, both moving toward her. Cormac released a long breath, then reached into the inner pocket of his coat, removed an object, and placed it on the table between them. The gold pocket watch engraved with the family crest, the heirloom that had once rested beside the morphine vial on the white cloth that Tuesday morning. For the first time throughout his story, his voice trembled slightly. I am sorry I allowed you to pay the price for my performance. You lost your license, your work, and even your name, so that an old man could survive while pretending to be confused. In this house, old people are only believed when they are close to death. Take it. It was once used to accuse you, so from this day forward, it must belong to you. Tessa looked at the heavy gold watch lying between them, an object worth more than everything she had ever owned combined, and she didn't take it. Instead, she reached across the table, gently took the old man's bony wrist, turned it over, placed her fingers in the familiar position, lowered her eyes to the small nurse's watch pinned to her chest, and began to count, her lips moving silently as they had through hundreds of night shifts, the habit of someone whose profession had entered her heart. Cormac Gallagher sat still and let her count, the 70-year-old man who had judged an entire family without blinking, allowing 2 tears to roll down his wrinkled cheeks. Then he laughed, a rough, hoarse laugh mingling with his tears, and Tessa laughed too, and cried too. 2 people who had both been deceived by an entire house sitting beside a sunlit window, one counting and one being counted. while the heartbeat beneath her fingers beat steadily, strongly, stubbornly, like the heart of a man determined to live long enough to watch justice finish its work. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning near the end of the month. Inside the third-floor conference room of the State Board of Nursing building, the same place where 5 months earlier the name Tessa Marlowe had been entered into the record beside the word suspended, and Judith Kane arrived before everyone else, placing 3 thick files, marked with 3 different colors of paper on the table, like a surgeon laying out her instruments before an operation. Tessa sat in the row reserved for the accused, wearing the only good suit still hanging in the closet of her rented room, her hands clasped together in her lap, and throughout the previous night, she had reminded herself that no matter what the outcome might be, she would sit with her back straight, because her mother had once taught her that people could take away a nurse's job, but they couldn't take away the way she carried herself. The board consisted of 7 members, seated behind a long table, faces accustomed to cases of professional error, and the same denials repeated again and again. They began in the flat voice of procedure, and then Judith Kane rose, fastened the button of her suit jacket, and peeled away every layer of the scheme before those 7 people in the precise order she had planned, not one beat too quickly, and not one beat too slowly. First came the footage from the backup storage system, projected onto the white screen at the end of the room, 90 seconds, showing a woman in silk gloves, standing before a staff locker that she had no reason to approach, her hand opening the zipper of the nursing bag, with the timestamp in the corner showing that this had occurred 14 hours before the evidence was announced as discovered, and the room became so quiet that the hum of the projector could be heard. Next came the chain of documents, the inventory report for the controlled medication cabinet signed to confirm that nothing was missing, and dated 1 day after the morphine vial appeared in the accused woman's bag, the pharmacy receipt proving that the heart medication with the incorrect strength had been specially ordered through an additional request approved by the mistress of the house, rather than delivered by mistake, every page enlarged, every signature compared, and Judith ended each document with the same question released into the air. Members of the board, when someone reports the loss of something that was never missing, and orders the wrong thing when no mistake was permitted, what would you call it? Then came the first witness, Mrs. Brennan, the woman who had served as housekeeper for 30 years, stepping to the witness stand, with her back straight and her voice steady through every word. She described the morning she had been forced to stand and watch while the evidence was arranged on a white cloth, spoke of the cufflink that had been handed to her several days earlier, and told them about the blister packs she had switched back each evening under the patient's orders. When one board member asked why she hadn't reported the truth immediately, she looked directly at him and answered, "Sir, because in that house, speaking the truth 1 day too soon meant dying 1 day too soon. We had to survive long enough for the truth to grow." The balance of the room had begun to shift, and everyone could feel it, but Judith Kane had kept one final card. When she asked the board's permission to call the last witness, the wooden door opened, and the entire room, including the chairperson who had occupied that seat for 15 years, fell still. Cormac Gallagher entered, 70 years old, leaning on a cane, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, pressed as sharply as it had been during the years when he controlled the entire harbor. He moved slowly and steadily down the aisle between the 2 rows of seats, the sound of his cane striking the wooden floor echoing through the absolute silence, because there wasn't a person in the state who didn't know that name, and no one had ever imagined that one day the man who carried it would voluntarily enter a government hearing room to testify. He sat in the witness chair, refused the glass of water offered to him, stated his name and age clearly, and when asked what he wished to present, the old man looked across the 7 faces behind the long table, then turned toward the nurse sitting with her back straight in the accused person's row and spoke. Neither quickly nor slowly, each word falling like stone. "I have spent my entire life reading people in order to survive. I recognize a traitor before he has the chance to betray me, and a liar before he opens his mouth. And I am sitting here today to tell you, with the weight of all those years, that inside my house, the only person who didn't lie to me was the nurse my family falsely accused," he continued, briefly and without sparing himself, speaking of the performance in which he pretended to be confused, of the medication, and of the price a 27-year-old woman had paid for his survival. He ended with a sentence that caused the chairperson to lower his eyes to the papers before him for a long moment. "Members of the board, my family owes your profession an apology. Return the girl's license. Leave the rest of the debt for me to repay." The board deliberated for less than 40 minutes. The decision was read before the full hearing room. Every allegation was dismissed. The disciplinary record was completely cleared, and her nursing license was restored with immediate effect, accompanied by a formal recommendation that all evidence be transferred to the prosecuting authorities for action against those involved. As part of the legal agreement Judith Kane had arranged in advance, a public letter of correction bearing Lorraine Draven's signature was read aloud inside the room and sent to every hospital that had received a telephone call that year. Each word like another stone, the proud woman had been forced to pick up with her own hands and place inside her mouth. That same afternoon, Tessa's former hospital called, not with the apologetic voice she remembered, but with the formal tone of the hospital director, inviting her to return as the lead nurse on the intensive care unit's night shift. That evening, Piper screamed so loudly over the telephone that Tessa had to hold it away from her ear. Her sister had received a new admission letter for the coming semester, and every restriction on her account had been removed. That night, inside her small rented room, Tessa sat at the table with her restored license lying before her and cried, for the first time since she was 19, without restraint and without hiding, crying for all the months she had stood in the rain outside the iron gates, for the nights she had scrubbed the floors of the nursing home, for every time she had lowered her face beneath the gaze reserved for a thief, and she understood that she wasn't crying because she had been rescued. A person could save herself from hunger and from debt, and Tessa had been doing that all her life. She cried because for the first time in her life, there were people who believed her honor was something worth returning whole, without one corner missing, the way a family heirloom should be returned. While justice was doing its work in Chicago, the man who had wound the entire machine into motion was nearly 7,000 kilometers away, living in a small apartment on a stone-paved hill in Lisbon, where the living room window looked directly over the Tagus River, broad as a bay, and slow ferries drew white trails through the water as they crossed between the two shores. He had chosen this city for no romantic reason, only because it was far enough away, old enough, and no one there owed the Gallagher family anything. Judith Kane arranged his withdrawal cleanly during the weeks after the celebration. Ronan's share in every former family operation was transferred into the legitimate maritime transportation company he had quietly built over 4 years, while his holdings in the remaining divisions were sold back to the council under Cormac's temporary supervision, cleanly, decisively, without leaving behind a single thread that could pull him back. Before signing the final document, he did one more thing that made Judith ask twice whether she had heard him correctly. He set aside a large portion of his personal fortune to establish a transparent compensation fund, independently audited, for the people who had been crushed during the past 20 years by the family's lending system, the small restaurants lost to organized crime, the families who had signed loan papers in desperate times and spent the rest of their lives paying for them. Emmett prepared the list. It was longer than Ronan had expected, and he read it from beginning to end in a single night, skipping no name. As a form of confession, the chapel could never perform for him. When he reached the name Marlowe, the medical debt in Piper's name that he had purchased and frozen, the fund administrator recommended forgiving it completely under the established criteria. Ronan drew a line through the name with his pen, while the person across from him watched in surprise, then said only that this debt wasn't to be paid with money from the fund. "Return the file to me. That one I have to repay myself." During his first days in Lisbon, he discovered something no book could teach, that freedom didn't come to a man like him as happiness. It came as exhaustion, a weariness reaching all the way into his bones the moment there was nothing left to guard. He slept 12 hours during those first days and still woke tired. He walked along the river while his shoulders tightened automatically whenever unfamiliar footsteps sounded behind him. In cafes, he still chose seats with his back against the wall by instinct. 34 years in a world where one careless moment could mean disappearance had taught his body a language. His mind couldn't simply command it to forget. And he understood that leaving his old world was the easy part. Teaching his body that it was safe was the difficult part. On his 9th night in the apartment, he stood outside the bedroom with his hand resting on the key, already inserted into the lock, as he had done every night of his life. Then he stopped, looked at the key for a long time, pulled it out, and left the door unlocked. He lay down and listened to the distant sound of ferry horns over the river, his heart beating irrationally fast for the first half hour. And then sleep came, deep and without dreams, the first night in Ronan Gallagher's life that he slept behind an unlocked door. The following morning, he woke to find sunlight reaching halfway across the bed, something so small it was almost absurd, and he remained still for another 10 minutes, simply to feel it. The past called only once. One afternoon, a message from an unknown number appeared on his telephone, and he recognized the voice in the writing before he had finished reading. Camille wrote at length, beginning with memories and ending with a number. She said that life at her mother's house was difficult, that the baby would soon be born and needed many things, that whatever had happened, he had once been her husband. Ronan read the message twice and felt no anger, which surprised even him. The anger had remained in Chicago with the walls covered in photographs. What remained was only clarity. He forwarded the entire message to the office, managing the child's trust that Cormac had established, along with a request that they review everything to ensure that every real need of the child, from hospital costs for the birth to formula, diapers, and regular medical examinations, would be paid directly by the trust to the hospital and the appropriate providers, fully, on time, without a single cent missing, because the child was innocent and would never be allowed to lack anything that decent adults still had the power to provide. Then he did one final thing. He blocked the sender's number, not to block a mother, but to block a woman trying to use her child as a key to reopen a door that had already closed. He didn't do it out of anger, because anger was something that still clung to a person. He did it because it was finished in the cleanest meaning of the word, like a ledger closed after its final line, like a harbor after every shipment had been cleared. That afternoon, he walked down the hill, bought a small potted plant for the windowsill, the first meaningless thing he had done in many years, and stood watching the Tagus River change color beneath the sunset. The man who had once owned so many buildings that he couldn't remember all their addresses now had only a rented apartment, a small plant, and an unlocked door. And for the first time, he felt rich in a way that couldn't be counted. Half a year passed, like another lifetime. Tessa had returned to the intensive care unit as the lead nurse on the night shift, moved out of her old rented room into a small apartment with a window that welcomed the morning sunlight, stood in the university courtyard waving as Piper ran toward her to show off her final grades for the semester. And once every month, she visited the gray stone house on the outskirts of the city to play chess with an old man who always tried to cheat and then blamed it on his age. Life had healed in the way new skin grows over a wound, still thin, still sensitive, but closed. Then, on a Saturday afternoon at the beginning of autumn, a delivery man rang the bell with a carefully wrapped parcel from Lisbon, and Tessa sat down at the kitchen table and opened each layer of paper, only to become still when she saw the object resting in the velvet lining, the gold pocket watch engraved with the Gallagher family crest, the heirloom that had once lain on the white cloth beside the vial of morphine on the worst morning of her life, the gift she had refused to accept from the old man in the gray stone house. Beneath the watch was a handwritten letter, the script straight and restrained like the man who had written it. She read, "My uncle told me that you refused to accept it, that you took his wrist instead of taking the gold." I believe the old man admitted defeat with genuine respect for the first time in his life, so he handed it back to me and told me to decide what should be done with it. "I would like to handle it this way. This object was once used as evidence against you. I want it to become evidence of the opposite. Evidence that something once used to harm a person can still be returned to its rightful meaning. And incidentally, there is a man in Lisbon who is relearning how to live with a pulse. He has learned how to sleep without locking the door and how to water a potted plant. But he still doesn't know how many times his heart beats in 1 minute when he is being honest. And he needs a good nurse more than he needs an empire. A round-trip plane ticket is inside the smaller envelope. Round trip. So the length of your answer remains entirely your decision." Tessa sat at the kitchen table for a very long time, the gold watch resting in her palm as heavily as a question, then laughed to herself when she realized that her other hand had somehow already picked up her telephone and begun checking the schedule for her vacation days. She flew there during the final week of September, and Ronan met her at the airport without flowers and without a driver, only a man in a gray sweater standing among the crowd, with the unfamiliar awkwardness of someone waiting for another person for the first time without any backup plan if she didn't come. They didn't return to the apartment immediately. He asked whether she was tired. She said she wanted to walk, and so they walked along the Tagus River beneath the afternoon sun, past stone-paved squares and old tram tracks, moving slowly and speaking little until the city lights came on, and the river turned into a ribbon of molten bronze. They stopped beside a stone railing, and Ronan said what he had practiced inside his mind for half a year, though when the moment came, he still had to stop halfway through and take a breath. He said, "I owe you a complete apology. Not the kind of apology that comes with explanations attached, the kind men like me usually offer. So I am going to say it properly. That night at the nursing home, you told me that I believed them without asking you a single question. You were right, and the truth is worse than that. I didn't refuse to ask, because the evidence was convincing. I refused because believing them was the easier choice. Asking you was the harder one. If I believed them, my life could continue exactly as it had. If I asked you, I would have to open my eyes and look again at my entire house, and I chose the easier road. A stranger guarded the heartbeat of the only family I had left every night, and when they threw you out through the gates, I signed the paper that helped them do it. It took 3 seconds. I am sorry, Tessa, for those 3 seconds and for every day you had to pay for them. I am not asking you to erase them. I only need you to know that I understand. The river wind moved between them. Tessa looked at the water for a while, then turned toward him and spoke in a voice, no softer and no harder than the truth. I was angry at that signature longer than I was angry at the people who framed me, because they were my enemies, while you only needed to ask one question. But I also saw what you did throughout the months that followed. What a person truly is can be seen in the way they repair what they have broken, and you repaired it with everything you had. He asked, "Where do we begin then?" She answered, slowly and honestly, "I am not good at trusting people. You are not good at being trusted. We will have to learn both." They remained beside the stone railing for a long time, and when the evening grew cold, Ronan raised his hand as though to place it around her shoulders, then stopped halfway and quietly asked, "May I?" Tessa looked at the hand suspended there, waiting for permission, the hand of a man who had once made an entire city afraid, and she laughed, nodded, and his arm settled around her shoulders, warm and careful, the way someone touches something that knows how to hurt. There was no swelling music, and no fireworks above the river, only two people who had broken in different places standing close enough to feel the warmth of the other, because she wasn't a reward heaven had given him for his years of suffering, and he wasn't compensation fate had sent her for hers. They were two people who had first healed their own wounds, then chosen each other with clear eyes and patient hearts, the way a person chooses something they intend to keep for the rest of their life. 2 years later, on the stone-paved hill leading down to the Tagus River, on the ground floor of an old building painted pale yellow, there was a small wooden sign engraved in 2 languages, Heartbeat Community Clinic, open 6 days a week, and most of the people who came through its doors were elderly residents of the old neighborhood, immigrants whose documents weren't yet complete, and families for whom an insurance card was a luxury that had never found a place inside their wallets. It had taken Tessa a year to turn that idea into real walls. She moved permanently to Lisbon after countless round-trip flights whose return journeys somehow grew shorter and shorter in a way that was difficult to explain to the hospital's personnel department, learned enough of the local language to ask patients about their symptoms, and earned the certification required to practice there. The money that built the clinic didn't come from the private pocket of the man she loved. She had refused that from the beginning. It came from the transparent compensation fund he had established years earlier, approved by the fund's board as an expansion project that remained true to its purpose. Money once born in darkness was now repaying its debt to the world through light. Every invoice was audited, every cent was recorded, and the man who kept those records worked in the small room behind the clinic, at a wooden desk beside the window. Ronan Gallagher, the man who had once controlled streams of money flowing unseen beneath an entire city, now sat balancing the cost of every bottle of medicine, every roll of bandage, and every shipment of medical gloves. Anyone looking in might have mistaken it for the decline of a powerful man. But those who knew the story understood the opposite was true, because every Friday evening, when he closed the weekly accounts and every number matched down to the final cent, he leaned back in his chair with a satisfaction that deals worth hundreds of millions had never brought him. Tessa once asked him why, and he answered that in the past, he had counted money to measure how powerful he was. Now he counted it to know how many more people could receive medical care the following month. The same arithmetic, a different life. They lived in the apartment on the 3rd floor of the same building. The small plant that had once stood alone on the windowsill had grown into an entire row of pots, and every Sunday afternoon, they walked beside the river as they had on that first afternoon, slowly, with few words and enough warmth. News from Chicago reached them once a month through Cormac's handwritten letters. The old man stubbornly rejected electronic mail to the very end, and his handwriting grew larger with each passing year. In his letter that early autumn, after 3 paragraphs complaining about the younger relative learning to manage the transportation company under his supervision, and about the doctor forbidding him from eating his favorite dish. He compressed the entire fate of the people from their old life into only a few lines. The trial is over. That lawyer received a sentence of many years after confessing to everything and blaming the woman for inventing the entire plan. The woman held a press conference through her attorney and claimed that she was only a victim who had been manipulated. The two people who once made promises to each other inside the chapel are now fighting in court over which of them deserves to be called the victim. You see, selfishness was what bound them together, and when you were no longer there to serve as their common obstacle, it turned inward and began tearing them apart, exactly as its nature demanded. I feel no satisfaction, only sorrow for two lives that chose to burn themselves away. As for the Draven household, the mother sold the large house and reportedly moved to a town where no one knows her name, so she won't have to face the eyes that remember her. Ronan read that passage at the breakfast table, folded the letter for a moment, then continued. Tessa watched his face and saw no trace of satisfaction, but no trace of pain remained either, only the quiet of someone who had traveled far enough beyond a fire that the smoke could no longer reach him. He had once told her that he no longer felt any desire to stand and watch the ruins continue burning, and it turned out that hadn't been a beautiful phrase. It was something real, something a person could only possess after spending years healing himself. But the part that left both of them sitting in silence that morning was hidden at the bottom of the envelope. A small photograph slipped out when Tessa turned the letter over. It showed a boy of about 3 years old on his first day of preschool, wearing a white shirt tucked into blue shorts, with a new backpack almost as large as his back, standing in a sunlit schoolyard with his eyes nearly closed from smiling, both hands raised proudly to show the cookie someone had just given him, healthy, round-cheeked, and happy in the way only a child could be happy. On the back of the photograph was the old man's large, trembling handwriting. The trust sent me this picture. The boy is growing quickly, eating well, and everyone at the preschool adores him. I have placed an identical photograph inside the lid of my chess box, so every time I open it to play, I see him smiling. The adults in this story owe more debts than can be counted, but at least we kept one promise. The child carries no one's debt. He carries only a new backpack. And that, my child, means this family has finally managed to do one decent thing completely right. Tessa held the photograph for a long time, then rose to find a small frame and placed it on top of the bookcase beside Piper's graduation portrait. Ronan looked at the two photographs standing together, one of a university graduate in her cap and gown, the other of a preschool boy holding a cookie, two children who shared no blood with each other, and neither of whom shared blood with him. Yet both were safe, because people who had once been broken had chosen not to pass their brokenness into the next generation. And he thought that perhaps this was the kindest definition of victory he had ever known. That Sunday morning, Lisbon awakened to the sound of church bells drifting across the red-tiled rooftops, and the Heartbeat Community Clinic opened earlier than usual, because weekends were always the busiest days for the elderly residents of the old neighborhood, some coming to have their blood pressure checked, some to collect their regular medication, and some who, in truth, came only because they wanted someone to ask how they had been. On the reception desk, beside a small vase of flowers, there was a new framed photograph of Piper in her nursing graduation gown, smiling radiantly in the university courtyard, following the same path as her mother and her sister. On the main wall of the waiting room, where other clinics usually displayed awards or landscape paintings, there was only one glass frame, and inside it wasn't a photograph, but a yellowed page of grid-lined paper, covered with the careful handwriting from a patient's monitoring notebook, with a line written in the middle of the night, recording a patient's heartbeat at 4 o'clock in the morning, steady and strong, accompanied by a small note in the margin, saying that the old man was sleeping peacefully. From time to time, a curious patient would ask why a clinic displayed an old sheet of paper with such honor, and the man who kept the accounts in the room at the back, when he happened to be there, would look up and answer in the local language with an accent that was still imperfect, though his eyes were absolutely clear, because that was the first time I understood that the thing broken inside my house had never been my uncle's heart. That morning, while changing the bandage of an elderly woman and listening to her talk about a grandchild who lived far away, Tessa suddenly paused in the middle of a thought, not because she was sad, but because she had just realized something strange. She had gone through an entire week, 7 complete days, without thinking once about the disciplinary board, about that Tuesday morning, or about the iron gates beneath the rain. Not once. The absence of that pain had arrived without warning. It hadn't come during a moment of victory, with no trumpets and no celebration. It had simply come quietly and sat beside her life like an old friend visiting without needing to knock, and she understood that this was what true healing looked like. It wasn't the day we won our case. It was the day we forgot to check the wound. This story would be told many more times, about the photographs covering an entire mansion, about a powerful man who chose documents instead of gunfire, about an old man who pretended to lose so that he could win. But if anything should remain after all of it, perhaps it would be these 3 simple truths. Power without a conscience is nothing more than fear wearing a suit. The people in this story once made others tremble, but in the end, all they ever possessed was the fear of other people, never their respect. And when the suit was stripped away, nothing remained beneath it. A home isn't measured by the number of rooms it contains, or the value written on its documents, but by whether anyone inside it sincerely counts another person's heartbeat. A mansion beside the lake can be emptier than a small rented room if the people in the mansion count only money, while someone in the rented room remains awake, waiting to hear a loved one's key turning in the lock after a late night. And the truth isn't a weapon of revenge, as many people believe. The truth is a pulse returned to a life that seemed to have stopped. It restored a nurse's license, returned clarity to an old man, gave a man the ability to sleep behind an unlocked door, and gave all of us back the belief that living honestly has never been foolish. Sometimes it simply requires a little more patience. If this story touched something in your heart, please press the like button and share this video with those who also believe that the truth will always find its way home in the end. Please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the compelling stories we share every day about quiet strength, the human heart, and the moment justice calls someone by name. And how did today's story make you feel? Which moment moved you most deeply? If you were Ronan, what would you have done? Please share the feelings from the deepest part of your heart in the comments. We sincerely hope to read every line you choose to share with us. Thank you for staying with this story until its final moment. We wish you and your family lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.